A crying baby on a plane is one of the most universally complained about experiences in modern life, and the psychology of why that is tells you something deeply important about how your brain is working against you every single day. The same sound that is unbearable to you is, to someone who spent years trying to have a child and cannot, one of the most poignant and painful sounds in the world. Same sound. Completely opposite emotional experience. And the mechanism that explains this difference is not empathy, not perspective. It is a specific and documented feature of how the human brain constructs the experience of reality itself. What you hear is not what is there. What you experience is a story your brain has already written about what is there. And once you understand how that story gets written, the way you experience your own life changes permanently. The mechanism starts with something almost no one has explained clearly. And it applies to every complaint, every frustration, and every moment of taken for granted fortune in your daily life. By the end of this video, you will understand the specific neuroscience and psychology behind why the same objective experience produces completely opposite emotional responses in different people, why your brain systematically generates complaints about things that others would grieve the absence of, and what the research has found about the specific practices that shift the perceptual frame, not through forced positivity, but through a documented, neurologically grounded change in how the brain constructs experience. This is real science, and it changes everything. The crying baby is not producing the irritation. Your appraisal of the crying baby is producing the irritation. This distinction between the stimulus and the appraisal is the foundation of what psychologists call appraisal theory of emotion. And it is one of the most important and most replicated findings in all of emotion research. Richard Lazarus at the University of California, Berkeley, whose work on stress and coping is among the most cited in the history of psychology, developed what became the foundational appraisal theory in the 1960s and 1970s. Lazarus argued, and the subsequent research confirmed, that emotions are not produced by events. They are produced by the cognitive evaluation of events relative to the person's goals, values, beliefs, and current circumstances. The same event produces different emotions in different people, not because different people have different feelings, but because different people perform different cognitive appraisals of the same event. The appraisal is the determination of what the event means, whether it is a threat or a benefit, an obstacle or an opportunity, a loss or a relief, relative to what matters to the specific person performing the appraisal. Research by Klaus Scherer at the University of Geneva expanded Lazarus's framework into a multi-dimensional appraisal model that identified the specific dimensions along which events are evaluated: novelty, intrinsic pleasantness, goal relevance, goal congruence, agency, coping potential, and norm compatibility. Each dimension contributes to the overall emotional response, and each dimension is evaluated not against an objective standard, but against the specific context of the person's current goals, circumstances, and history. The crying baby is evaluated by the exhausted traveler as novel enough to register it is breaking the desired silence, intrinsically unpleasant, the sound itself is aversive, and dishu shaki chueluas. Goal incongruent, it is interfering with the desire for quiet, with low coping potential. There is nothing they can do about it. The appraisal produces irritation. The same crying baby is evaluated by someone who has spent years trying and failing to conceive as intrinsically familiar in a way that is painful rather than unpleasant. Goal incongruent in a different sense. It is a reminder of what they want and do not have, with enormous goal relevance, but in the direction of loss rather than interference. The appraisal produces a completely different emotional response: grief, longing, perhaps bittersweet recognition. Same decibel level, same frequency, same duration. Two completely different experienced realities. Not because the experience is being filtered by willpower or discipline or mindfulness practice, because the appraisal systems of two different brains, with two different histories and two different sets of what matters, are producing two genuinely different psychological events from the same physical stimulus. This is the starting point of everything we are going to discuss, but it leads immediately to the most important and the most uncomfortable question. If your emotional experience is produced by your appraisals rather than by events themselves, what is determining your appraisals? And is the determination in your control in any meaningful sense? Research by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, two of the most influential psychologists in the history of the field, on what they called reference-dependent evaluation, established that the human brain does not evaluate circumstances in absolute terms. It evaluates them relative to a reference point. And the reference point is almost never the objective baseline of what is genuinely available or what would constitute genuine loss. It is whatever the current or recently remembered state of affairs is. The technical term is adaptation level. Herbert Helson at the University of Kansas established the adaptation level theory in the 1960s. People adapt to their current circumstances and then evaluate new experiences relative to the adapted baseline. What feels good or bad is not determined by the absolute quality of the experience, but by how it compares to what the person has become accustomed to. The traveler who is used to quiet is evaluating the crying baby relative to a reference point of silence. The standard is silence, the deviation is noise. The deviation is experienced as negative. The person who has been trying to have a child is evaluating the same crying baby relative to a different reference point entirely, one organized around absence rather than presence. The standard that makes the sound painful is not one of excessive noise. It is one of not having what the sound represents. Research by Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell in their foundational 1971 paper that introduced the hedonic treadmill concept, established that the adaptation level mechanism produces a specific and consistent outcome across human lives. People adapt to improvements in their circumstances, and the improvements that once produced genuine positive emotion become the new baseline against which the next improvement is measured. The health that was once desperately wanted becomes the invisible background against which minor ailments are complained about. The relationship that was once longed for becomes the context within which small frustrations are amplified. The freedom that was once fought for becomes the structure within which new constraints are noticed and resented. The adapting person on the plane has adapted to health, adapted to the freedom of travel, adapted to the remarkable fact of being in a metal tube moving through the sky at 500 miles per hour. What was once extraordinary, a literal miracle of engineering, is now so ordinary that the specific complaint of the moment occupies the entire experiential foreground. The reference point has moved, and the crying baby, measured against the adapted reference point of comfortable ordinary life, registers as a genuine disruption of what is expected and deserved. Research by Ed Diener at the University of Illinois on subjective well-being across life circumstances found that the adaptation mechanism is one of the most consistent and most robust findings in well-being research. People adapt to dramatically improved circumstances within months, returning to a well-being baseline that is surprisingly stable across very different objective life situations. And they adapt to stable good circumstances so completely that those circumstances become invisible, functioning as the background against which new complaints are registered, rather than as the source of ongoing gratitude. But here's the finding that changes how you understand the adaptation mechanism, and that makes the crying baby a far more consequential psychological lesson than it appears. The adaptation mechanism does not adapt equally to positive and negative experiences. Research by Roy Baumeister and colleagues at Florida State University on negativity bias, a finding we have discussed in several previous videos on this channel, established that negative stimuli, negative events, and negative information receive systematically more attentional processing, stronger encoding in memory, and greater influence on behavior and judgment than equivalent positive stimuli. The brain is not a neutral evaluator that weights positive and negative experience equally. It is, in the most literal neurological sense, more reactive to bad than to good. This asymmetry was adaptive in the evolutionary environment where missing a threat cost you your life, while missing an opportunity merely cost you a meal. The asymmetry is not a character flaw. It is the operating system of a nervous system built for survival in a hostile environment. But the asymmetry has a specific consequence in the modern world. The good things in your life, by virtue of their persistence and their safety, are systematically invisible. Not because they are less real, because the threat detection system that is most active in generating conscious experience is not activated by the absence of problems. It is activated by the presence of them. The health you have right now, the specific remarkable fact of your body functioning, breathing, processing, responding, is not flagging the attention system because it is not a threat. The minor health complaint, by contrast, is commanding full attentional engagement because the nervous system is registering it as a potential departure from the baseline it is organized to protect. Research by Jonathan Haidt at New York University on moral emotions found that the perception of loss and the perception of unfairness are among the most potent activators of strong negative emotion, and that both are reference dependent. Loss is defined relative to the reference point of what was had. Unfairness is defined relative to the reference point of what was expected. The adapted baseline, the things you have had long enough to take for granted, defines both the standard for what you are entitled to have and the reference point against which losses are measured. The crying baby is experienced as a loss of quiet, of peace, of the undisturbed journey that the adapted nervous system has come to expect. And losses, research consistently shows, are psychologically weighted more heavily than equivalent gains. A loss of something worth 10 units of well-being is experienced as worse than the gain of something worth 10 units of well-being feels good. The asymmetry of loss aversion, documented extensively by Kahneman and Tversky, means that the crying baby's intrusion into the expected quiet feels worse than the silence was making you feel good. But the person who cannot have a child is not experiencing a loss in the same sense. They are experiencing the visibility of an absence, a reference point defined not by what was taken but by what was never present. And the visibility of an absence produces a different and in some ways more profound form of longing than the visibility of a loss. Research by Jordi Koitbach at the University of Zurich on what he calls thinking negatively to feel positive found that the deliberate contemplation of what one does not have, and then the return to awareness of what one does have, produces measurable increases in positive affect and appreciation. The absence, briefly imagined, makes the presence vivid in a way that steady possession cannot. The crying baby is doing this, involuntarily and with tremendous force, for the person who cannot have a child. It is making visible, through the mechanism of contrast, the specific value of something that familiarity has rendered invisible to the adapted perceiver. And the question the research is building toward is this: can this contrast be deliberately accessed? Can the mechanism that the crying baby activates involuntarily, the sudden vivid visibility of what is absent and therefore what is present, be developed as a voluntary practice that changes the ordinary experience of ordinary life? The answer is yes, and the research on how to do it is both specific and genuinely compelling. But first, there is a dimension of this story that we have not yet addressed: the specific psychology of the person who cannot have a child, and what their experience reveals about the rest of ours. Research on infertility and its psychological consequences is one of the most specific and most emotionally significant bodies of work in clinical psychology. And what it reveals about the experience of wanting something that is taken for granted by most of the people around you is directly relevant to everything we are examining. Research by Julia Manning at the Infertility Project found that infertility is consistently rated by those experiencing it as among the most stressful life experiences they have encountered, comparable in reported psychological impact to the diagnosis of serious medical conditions. The specific quality of the distress is not simply sadness at the absence of something wanted. It is the particular pain of being surrounded by the casual presence of something you desperately want and cannot access. Research by the National Infertility Association in the United States found that the social experience of infertility is characterized by a specific form of painful visibility. Everywhere, the thing that is absent from your life is present in the lives of people around you, at social gatherings, in public spaces, in the casual conversations of people who do not think to consider that the thing they are casually referencing might be the thing someone near them most deeply grieves. Research by Annette Stanton at UCLA on coping with infertility found that one of the most consistently reported difficulties is the experience of social contexts in which the thing being longed for is both ubiquitous and unacknowledged. Baby showers. The casual announcement of a pregnancy, the crying baby on the plane, each of these is a small, social, ordinary event that carries, for the person experiencing infertility, an enormous weight of contrast between what is ordinary for others and what is inaccessible for them. The specific quality of this experience, being in a social environment where the thing you most want is the thing everyone else takes for granted, has been documented across domains beyond infertility. Research by Brock Bastian at the University of Melbourne on social exclusion found that the presence of others enjoying something that you are excluded from is a particularly potent and particularly painful form of social comparison. The visibility of others' access to what you lack amplifies the sense of your own lack in ways that the absence itself without that social comparison does not. But the research on what happens to people after they come to terms with infertility, or with any other significant absence from their lives that they desperately wanted, reveals something that is directly relevant to the larger lesson of the crying baby. Research by Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina on post-traumatic growth found that a substantial proportion of people who have experienced significant losses or absences, including the inability to have children, report genuine positive changes in the aftermath of genuine engagement with the experience. Not that the loss was worth it, not that the absence is secretly a gift, but that the process of living through a significant absence and finding genuine meaning and genuine life within that absence produced a specific quality of appreciation for other things, a specific depth of relationship with others who understand, and a specific clarity about what actually matters that a life without the absence might not have generated. These people, the ones who have genuinely engaged with significant longing and found genuine life within it, have often developed something that the crying baby complainer has not. The specific capacity to see the presence of what they do have, rather than only the absence of what they don't. The capacity that the crying baby is forcing the complainer to exercise for just a moment, involuntarily by making the contrast visible. Before we talk about what actually works, let's be honest about what doesn't. Because the most common response to the crying baby insight, think of people who have it worse. Be grateful for what you have, is both correct in direction and almost entirely ineffective in practice. Research by Nico Freida at the University of Amsterdam on the law of concern In emotion established that the emotional impact of a situation is determined by its relevance to personal concerns, to what the specific person genuinely cares about, values, and is organized around. Merely knowing that others have it worse does not change the appraisal because it does not change the reference point that the appraisal is computed against. The irritated traveler on the plane knows, in some abstract sense, that many people in the world have never been on a plane and are facing far greater difficulties than a crying baby. The knowledge is available, it does not change the irritation, because the irritation is not produced by an absence of information about the world's problems. It is produced by a specific appraisal system running against the specific reference point of what this person's adapted nervous system expects. Research by Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia on the empathy gap, the specific difficulty of genuinely feeling the perspective of someone in a very different situation, found that people consistently overestimate their capacity to imaginatively adopt another person's perspective and feel what they would feel in that situation. The actual imaginative effort required to genuinely shift one's experiential frame, to not just know but actually feel even briefly the different appraisal that a different reference point would produce, is considerably greater than most people perform when they tell themselves to count their blessings. Research by Laura Aknin at Simon Fraser University and colleagues on the relationship between gratitude practices and well-being found that generic gratitude exercises list 5 things you are grateful for, produce smaller and less durable well-being improvements than gratitude practices that are specific, vivid, and involve genuine imaginative engagement with the specific value of the specific thing being appreciated. The effectiveness is in the specificity and the genuine imaginative engagement, not in the endorsement of a general category. The reason think of people who have it worse is not sufficient is not that the principle is wrong. It is that the principle, applied abstractly and quickly, does not actually change the appraisal. It adds a piece of information, others have it worse, to the cognitive foreground without changing the reference point that the appraisal system is using. The reference point remains the adapted baseline of comfortable expected life. The additional information sits alongside the irritation rather than revising the appraisal that is generating it. What does change the appraisal, what the research has found actually works, is something more specific, more embodied, and more neurologically active than the generic gratitude instruction. And it involves a mechanism that both the crying baby story and the research on genuine perspective shift have been pointing toward throughout this video. Research by Timothy Wilson and his colleagues on mental subtraction, the deliberate imagining of the absence of something currently present and valued, produced findings that directly address the gap between generic gratitude instruction and genuine perceptual shift. Wilson's research found that people who engaged in genuine mental subtraction, who briefly but vividly imagined that a specific positive aspect of their current life had never occurred, then returned to awareness of the actual present, showed significantly greater appreciation for that aspect of their life compared to people who simply thought about how the positive thing had happened. The mechanism is the contrast effect. The momentary experience of absence makes the presence vivid in a way that continuous presence cannot. The reference point temporarily shifts from comfortable adapted baseline to baseline without this thing. And measured against that baseline, the actual present is experienced with a quality of genuine appreciation that the adapted baseline prevents. Research by Jody Koidbach and colleagues found that a specific variation of this, deliberately imagining how things could have been worse rather than how they could be better, produces the most reliable and most durable increases in positive affect. The downward comparison to an imagined worse scenario is more effective than the upward comparison to an imagined better scenario, precisely because it shifts the reference point in the direction that produces genuine appreciation for the actual present. The crying baby is doing mental subtraction by contrast for the person who cannot have one. It is not showing them an abstract principle. It is viscerally, concretely, audibly demonstrating the specific value of something that the comfortable traveler has adapted to and rendered invisible. The contrast is embodied. The reference point shift is felt rather than merely thought. And the result is a genuine experiential difference rather than the addition of information that sits alongside an unchanged emotional response. Research by Fred Bryant at Loyola University Chicago on savoring the deliberate prolonging and deepening of positive experience found that the specific practice of attending carefully to the specific sensory and emotional content of a positive experience is both more effective and more pleasurable than abstract appreciation. When you attend to the specific quality of what is present, the specific sound, the specific sensation, the specific quality of the circumstance, The adaptive overlay that makes the familiar invisible is at least partially bypassed, and the research suggests something specific about why embodied contrast is more effective than abstract instruction. The appraisal system that generates emotion is not primarily a propositional linguistic system. It is a rapid pattern-matching, affect-generating system that operates on perceptual and imaginative content rather than on logical arguments. To change the emotional response to the crying baby, or to anything else in ordinary life that has been adapted to and rendered invisible by familiarity, you need to change the content of the appraisal, not add an argument about why the appraisal should be different. The vivid imagining of the absence, the genuine, specific, imaginatively real contemplation of what the world without this would feel like, is the content change that produces a different appraisal. The argument that you should be grateful because others have it worse is the logical addendum that leaves the appraisal unchanged. This distinction between content change and argumentative addition is the most important practical insight in the entire psychology of perspective shift, and it leads directly to the practices that actually move the needle. Here is the insight that this entire video has been building toward, and it requires stepping back from the individual example, the crying baby, the irritated traveler, the grieving parent, and looking at the larger pattern that the research reveals. Your experience of your own life is more than you likely realize a function of the reference points that your appraisal system is operating against. Those reference points are largely set by adaptation, by what you have had long enough to stop noticing, and the adaptation is largely invisible to you because the adapted to things have faded into the background of the ordinary. The crying baby story is not primarily a story about infertility. It is a story about how dramatically different the same objective reality looks from different reference points. The traveler's reference point makes the crying baby an intrusion. The grieving parent's reference point makes it a representation of everything they long for. The baby is neither intrusion nor treasure. It is sound. The meaning is entirely constructed by the appraisal system, operating against the specific background of each person's particular history. Research by Daniel Gilbert at Harvard on affective forecasting, the prediction of how future events will make you feel, established that people are systematically wrong about what will make them happy and for how long. One of the primary sources of this error is the focalism bias. The tendency to focus only on the specific event being predicted while ignoring the full context of the future in which that event would be experienced. The baby on the plane is the focus. The full context, the health, the freedom of travel, the relative safety and comfort of the journey is not part of the focus. And focusing only on the intrusion while ignoring the context is precisely the appraisal error that produces disproportionate irritation. Research by Sonia Lubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside, on what she calls hedonic adaptation prevention, found that the most effective strategies for maintaining appreciation for positive circumstances are the ones that interrupt the adaptation mechanism rather than arguing against it. The adaptation mechanism cannot be turned off by instruction, but it can be interrupted by novelty, by deliberate variation of how positive circumstances are engaged with, and by the specific practice of imagined contrast that Wilson's research identified. The person who develops a genuine practice of deliberate contrast, who regularly, briefly, and specifically imagines what the world without certain currently present goods would feel like, is building a perceptual habit that counteracts adaptation at the level of the appraisal system rather than the level of argument. They are not becoming more optimistic. They are becoming more accurate, more genuinely perceptive of what is actually present in their life, because the contrast is shifting the reference point in ways that bring the background forward. Research by Robert Emmons at the University of California, Davis, on gratitude practices found that the most effective gratitude interventions share a common feature. They require the person to genuinely attend to the specific value of the specific thing being appreciated, rather than endorsing general categories. The power of the practice is in the specificity and the genuine imaginative engagement, not in the performative endorsement of the category, things to be grateful for. That's the outcome. And here is the most important finding of this entire section. The one that changes how you understand the relationship between the irritated traveler and the grieving parent. The irritated traveler is not wrong to be irritated. The sound of a crying baby is genuinely aversive. The appraisal is neurologically grounded and evolutionarily appropriate. The nervous system is not making an error, but the irritated traveler is missing something. Something that is genuinely present. The remarkable ordinary fact of their health, their freedom, their access to experiences that billions of people will never have. That is genuinely worth appreciating, and that the adapted reference point has made functionally invisible. The grieving parent is not wrong to be in pain, the longing is real, and the absence is real, and the contrast produced by the baby's presence is genuinely painful. But the grieving parent has, through the mechanism of their longing, access to something the irritated traveler does not. The vivid, immediate, felt sense of the value of what is present in their life, made visible by the contrast with what is absent. Their pain is real, and so is the specific perceptual clarity that the pain is producing. The specific quality of seeing the world through a reference point that has not been adapted to. That registers things as valuable precisely because they have not been taken for granted. The psychological practice that the research is describing, the deliberate, regular, vivid engagement with the contrast between what you have and what you would have without it, is the attempt to develop voluntarily and without the tragic mechanism, the specific perceptual access that the grieving parent has involuntarily, not the pain. The clarity that the pain is generating. That clarity is available without the pain. But it requires deliberate, specific, neurologically engaging practice to develop. And the research has found that the people who develop it are not simply happier in the moment, they are living with a fundamentally different quality of engagement with their ordinary experience. Let's translate the research into practices. Because this is the question every video on this channel eventually arrives at: what do you actually do? The research has identified 6 specific practices that build the specific perceptual capacity we have been describing, the voluntary version of the perspective shift that the crying baby forces involuntarily. The first practice is vivid mental subtraction, the core technique. Timothy Wilson's research is the foundation. The practice: once per day or once per week, select one specific aspect of your current life that has been present long enough to be adapted to, your health, a specific relationship, a specific circumstance or capability, and spend 5 to 10 minutes genuinely, specifically, vividly imagining what your life would look like without it, not abstractly. In specific detail, what would yesterday have looked like without this thing? What would this morning have felt like? What would right now be like? The imaginative engagement needs to be genuine and specific, not cursory. The brain's appraisal system responds to imaginative content that is sufficiently vivid to be processed as near real. A brief, abstract endorsement of the absence does not produce the contrast effect. A genuine, specific, embodied imagining of the absent world does. Then return to the actual present. And notice what the contrast produces. Research found that this practice, done with genuine specificity, produces measurable increases in positive affect and appreciation that are not produced by simply thinking about how the positive thing happened. The second practice is the specific gratitude letter, moving gratitude from abstract to relational. Research by Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania found that among the positive psychology interventions his team tested, the gratitude visit, writing a specific detailed letter of gratitude to a specific person for a specific thing they contributed to your life, then delivering it in person, produced among the largest and most lasting well-being improvements of all interventions tested. Not a generic, "I'm grateful for the people in my life." A specific letter to a specific person about a specific contribution, delivered in a way that makes the gratitude real and relational. The practice works because it requires the specific imaginative engagement that makes gratitude neurologically effective rather than merely endorsed. Writing in specific detail about what a specific person contributed and what your life would be without that contribution is a form of mental subtraction made relational, and the relational dimension amplifies the emotional impact. The third practice is deliberate novelty of engagement, combating adaptation through variation. Research by Lubomirsky on hedonic adaptation prevention found that one of the most effective strategies for maintaining appreciation for positive circumstances is variety, varying the way positive experiences are engaged with so that the prediction system cannot build a complete model and render the experience fully automatic. The practical version: deliberately vary how you engage with the things that have become ordinary. Take a different route to the place you go every day. Notice something specific about the person you see every day that you have not noticed before. Approach the activity you do every day with a deliberate question. What is in this that I have stopped attending to? The novelty of attention is not the same as novelty of circumstance. The same circumstances can be approached with fresh attention through the deliberate choice to look rather than to merely process. The fourth practice is the crying baby exercise, deliberate perspective taking through embodied imagination. This practice directly addresses the social dimension of the crying baby story. The exercise: when you encounter something that is generating irritation or complaint, briefly but genuinely ask the question: is there someone for whom this specific thing would be precious rather than annoying, for whom its presence, or the circumstances that produce it, would be the thing they most deeply want? The crying baby, the crowded public space, the noisy family gathering, the early morning that requires getting up, the body that is complaining. For each of these, there is a specific imaginable person for whom that specific thing would be a form of abundance rather than an inconvenience. The deliberate, genuine imagining of that perspective, not the abstract endorsement of the principle, But the specific imaginative engagement with a different reference point is the contrast exercise made socially active. Research by Sarah Hodges and colleagues at the University of Oregon on perspective taking found that the most effective forms of perspective taking involve genuine imaginative engagement with the specific content of the other person's experience rather than inference from general principles. What would it be like to be them in this situation with their specific history and their specific reference points? Is a more neurologically effective perspective taking exercise than I should be grateful because others have it worse. The fifth practice is temporal distancing, using the future as a contrast. Research by Laura Nordgren at Northwestern University on the 10-year question found that asking how you will feel about a current situation in 10 years produces measurable reductions in the emotional intensity of negative responses to that situation and measurable increases in perspective and equanimity. Applied in the other direction, the 10-year question asked backward, how will you look back on this period of your life from 10 years in the future? What will be visible from that vantage point that is invisible in the irritated foreground of the present moment? The health, the freedom, the people, the circumstances? What will be gone or diminished that is so present now it cannot even be seen? The temporal distance produces a version of the contrast effect by projecting you into a position where the current moment is the past that is being appreciated in retrospect. And research on nostalgia, the emotional experience of positively evaluating past experiences, finds that the qualities most universally appreciated in retrospect are precisely the qualities that are most consistently taken for granted in the present. The ordinary health, the ordinary freedom, the ordinary presence of people who mattered. The sixth practice is regular deliberate exposure to perspectives different from your own. Research by Nicholas Ipley at the University of Chicago on the social psychology of perspective and understanding found that genuine exposure to the specific, detailed life experiences of people with very different reference points from one's own, not abstract knowledge that others have different lives, but genuine specific engagement with the details of those lives, produces measurable changes in the appraisal patterns that listeners apply to their own circumstances. The practical version: seek out specific accounts of experiences that are genuinely different from your own, with enough detail that the imaginative engagement becomes genuine, not the general statistic about global poverty, the specific account of a specific person's specific day in circumstances very different from yours. The memoir, the long-form interview, the conversation with genuine curiosity about what someone else's ordinary day looks and feels like. The specificity is what produces the appraisal change. There is a risk in the practice of deliberate perspective taking that the research has identified and that any responsible account of this topic needs to address directly. Research by Charles Figley at Tulane University and others on compassion fatigue, the depletion of emotional resources that occurs in people who are exposed to excessive suffering through their work or their deliberate attention to others' pain, established that regular, intensive, emotionally engaged perspective taking on genuinely painful experiences can be psychologically costly. The emotional system that is most engaged by genuine perspective taking is also the emotional system that can be depleted by excessive activation. The practices we have been discussing are not invitations to a sustained diet of contemplating others' suffering. They are invitations to specific, brief, genuine engagements with different reference points. Engagements that shift the appraisal and then allow the return to the actual present with a different quality of attention. The distinction that research by Olga Klimecki at the University of Geneva and Tanya Singa at the Max Planck Institute makes between empathy and compassion is directly relevant here. Empathy, the vicarious feeling of another's pain, activates the same neural systems as the pain itself and can produce the same depleting effects when sustained over time. Compassion, the caring recognition of another's difficulty combined with a motivation to support rather than a full sharing of the pain, activates different neural systems and does not show the same depletion effects. The practices we have been discussing are closer to compassion than to empathy. They involve the recognition and brief imaginative engagement with a different reference point, not a sustained empathic immersion in another person's suffering. The brief visit to a different appraisal system, long enough to shift the reference point, short enough not to be depleting, is the target. Research by Klimecki found that compassion training, specifically the development of the caring recognition response rather than the full empathic sharing response, is associated with positive outcomes rather than the burnout associated with excessive empathy. The goal is not to feel as bad as the person who cannot have a child. The goal is to recognize briefly and genuinely the value of what their reference point makes visible in your ordinary life. There is one more dimension of the crying baby story that deserves direct attention, the social one. Because the crying baby on the plane is not only a psychology of perception story, it is also a story about what happens in a social space when people are operating from different reference points without knowing it. The irritated traveler does not know about the grieving parent. The grieving parent does not know about the traveler's specific history. They are sharing a physical space while inhabiting what are, psychologically, completely different worlds, constructed by the same physical stimulus but organized around completely different reference points, and producing completely different emotional experiences. Research by Nicholas Ipley and Eugene Caruso at the University of Chicago on what they call naive realism. The specific tendency to experience one's own perception as the direct, accurate registration of reality, and to assume that others who perceive differently are either uninformed, biased, or mistaken, found that people consistently underestimate the degree to which their perception of a situation is shaped by their own reference point rather than by the objective features of the situation. The irritated traveler is not conscious of having an appraisal. They are simply experiencing the crying baby as annoying. The experience feels like a direct registration of the objective character of the situation, the baby is objectively being disruptive, rather than like a construction of the appraisal system operating against an adapted reference point. Research by Heidi Grant Halverson at Columbia Business School on the gap between intention and perception found that people's experience of their own responses feels transparent to them in ways that it does not look from the outside. The irritation feels like an obvious, justified response to an obviously disruptive situation. The idea that someone nearby might be experiencing the same situation as a form of precious longing is not only counterintuitive, it is experientially implausible from within the adapted reference point. The social implication is significant. In any shared space, people are experiencing the same objective events through different appraisal systems operating against different reference points. The crying baby story is an extreme example, but the principle applies to virtually every social situation where people appear to be disagreeing about the significance or meaning of a shared experience. They are not simply having different opinions, they are having genuinely different experiences. Experiences that are constructed by their specific histories, their specific adaptations, their specific reference points. Research by Daniel Kahneman on What You See Is All There Is, the tendency of the mind to treat its current frame as the complete picture, found that people consistently fail to account for the information they are not seeing when evaluating situations. The irritated traveler is not seeing the grieving parent's reference point. The grieving parent may not be seeing the exhausted traveler's genuine need for rest. Both are operating on incomplete information about the other's appraisal system. The specific practice that social research recommends in these situations is not more empathy in the generic sense. It is the deliberate, genuine awareness that other people in the same physical space may be having genuinely different experiences of the same stimulus, and the specific curiosity that this awareness generates about what reference point the other person might be operating from. This curiosity does not resolve the irritation. It does not require the traveler to stop finding the baby's crying aversive. But it does something specific and documented. It shifts the appraisal of the social situation from a disruptive event that everyone is experiencing as I am to a situation that people in this space are experiencing differently for reasons I cannot fully see. And that shift, the research shows, is associated with greater tolerance, greater patience, and in some cases, the specific form of compassion that arises when another person's pain becomes briefly visible. Research by Michael McCullough at the University of Miami on the psychology of gratitude identified something that initially seems paradoxical. The people who are most naturally disposed to gratitude are not the people who have experienced the least difficulty in their lives. In fact, research consistently finds that people who have experienced significant adversity, including significant loss, including the longing for things they cannot have, often show higher levels of genuine gratitude than people who have experienced more comfortable lives. The mechanism is exactly what the crying baby story is pointing at. The experience of significant absence, of things being taken away or of things never being present, interrupts the adaptation that makes the good things invisible. The reference point shifts in ways that make the ordinary visible as the extraordinary thing it actually is. Research by Philip Watkins at Eastern Washington University on the relationship between gratitude and subjective well-being found that gratitude is not primarily a personality trait that is randomly distributed. It is a cognitive and perceptual capacity that is strongly related to what he calls perceived debt, the genuine sense of having received something valuable that was not guaranteed or deserved. People who have experienced genuine lack, who have confronted the specific fragility of things they might have had and do not, or things they had and lost, develop a much stronger sense of perceived debt toward the things they do have. The chronic complainer is not a bad person. The chronic complainer is a person who has been fortunate enough to adapt to a baseline of comfort that is sufficiently stable that it has become invisible, and whose appraisal system is therefore generating full engagement with the deviations from that baseline while registering nothing notable about the baseline itself. The profoundly grateful person has, in most cases, had their reference point shifted either by genuine adversity, by a sustained practice of deliberate contrast, or by the specific quality of attention that produces genuine perception of the ordinary as extraordinary. They are not experiencing different circumstances. They are experiencing the same circumstances through an appraisal system that is operating against a different reference point, one that makes visible what the comfortable adapted baseline renders invisible. The goal of everything this video has been discussing is not to become a different person. It is to develop the specific perceptual capacity that the difference between these two types of people represents. The capacity to see what is actually present, the health, the freedom, the ordinary good fortune that a different reference point would immediately recognize as precious, rather than seeing only the deviations from the adapted baseline. That capacity is not primarily a matter of positive thinking or good character. It is a matter of specific, deliberate, regularly practiced cognitive engagement with the contrast that reveals what adaptation has covered. The practices described in the previous section are the vehicle. The result, practiced consistently over time, is a genuinely different experiential relationship with the ordinary day. Let's take the widest possible view of everything we have covered in this video. The crying baby on the plane is, from the irritated traveler's perspective, a brief inconvenience in an otherwise comfortable journey. From the grieving parent's perspective, it is a sound that makes visible, through the mechanism of painful contrast, the specific value of something that the comfortable world has made invisible to the people who have it. Both perspectives are real, both emotional responses are neurologically grounded and psychologically understandable. Neither person is wrong in any simple sense, but the research is pointing towards something important about the quality of life available from each perspective. The irritated traveler is living in a world where comfort is expected and disturbance is registered. The ordinary good, the health, the freedom, the access to experiences that most people in the world will never have, is invisible because it has been adapted to. What fills the experiential foreground are the deviations from the expected comfortable baseline. The deviations are real, but they are not the whole of what is there. The person who cannot have a child is living in a world where the ordinary presence of what they long for is acutely visible wherever it appears. The pain is real. And this is the part that the research finds consistently and that is worth naming clearly. The specific quality of attention that the pain has produced is one of the most significant and most valuable perceptual capacities available to a human being. The capacity to see the actual value of what is ordinarily invisible. Research by the Harvard Study of Adult Development, the longest longitudinal study of human well-being in history, found that the quality of engagement with the actual circumstances of ordinary life is one of the strongest predictors of well-being across the lifespan, not the quality of the circumstances themselves, the quality of the engagement, the degree to which the person is genuinely present to, genuinely appreciative of, and genuinely in contact with what is actually there. The crying baby is an invitation. Not to perform gratitude, not to pretend that the crying is not aversive, but to notice in the specific contrast that the crying baby's presence creates for a different person, something about the ordinary good fortune that is present in the background of your own experience, and to let that noticing do the specific work that the research says it does. Shift the reference point, interrupt the adaptation, and allow the actual quality of the actual life you are living to be briefly and genuinely visible. That visibility is not a permanent state. The adaptation will reassert itself. The reference point will drift back toward the comfortable baseline. The invisible will become invisible again. But the practice of returning, of deliberately, regularly creating the specific contrast that makes the ordinary visible, is the thing that, built into the texture of daily life, produces a genuinely different quality of relationship with the ordinary day. Not more positive circumstances, more genuine perception of the circumstances that are already there. The crying baby is saying, you already have what someone else is grieving the absence of. The question is whether you are going to let that be visible to you right now while you have it, or whether you are going to wait for the kind of contrast that teaches this lesson the hard way. Here is what I want to leave with you. The next time something ordinary generates genuine irritation, the delay, the noise, the minor inconvenience, the small deviation from the expected comfortable baseline, pause before the complaint. Not to suppress the irritation, not to perform gratitude, just to ask one genuine question. Is there someone for whom the presence of the thing that is annoying me, or the circumstances that make this situation possible, would be something they would give almost anything to have? The crying baby, the crowded space, the opportunity to be somewhere at all, the body that is capable of complaining, the day that has things in it worth complaining about. Let the question be genuine. Let it produce the brief contrast. And then let the contrast do the specific work that the research says it does. Shifting the reference point, making the invisible briefly visible, allowing what is ordinarily taken for granted to be, just for a moment, perceived as the specific form of ordinary, extraordinary fortune that it actually is. That moment of genuine perception, brief, specific, neurologically real, is the beginning of the perceptual practice that changes ordinary life from a series of deviations from an expected comfortable baseline into the genuinely remarkable thing that it is for everyone who has it and can see it. if this kind of specific, research grounded, honest conversation about how the mind constructs experience and what can be done to construct it more accurately and more richly is what you're looking for. This channel is built for exactly that. Every video is the same commitment, the science of how the human mind works and what it means for the life you're actually living. See you in the next one.